Hey there, Helen. How are you?
Hey, Ethan. I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing okay too. So we are into the second week of this crisis unfolding in the Middle East. I think week one we were both. I mean, we hopped on a Zoom right after the news broke on Saturday, the 7th. I think we were so paralyzed, I guess, by the grief, and we still are in so many ways, to really understand just how impactful this event could be. Now in week two, we know we're starting to see the contours of this conflict take shape. And so if week one was the acute, angry, grieving phase, and we're still not quite out of it, week two has been, we've seen a global effort to try to wrap our arms around it and keep it from spreading. So I think the theme of this episode will be something like, I guess we could call it the diplomatic blitz. But before we get to that, there are still events happening. So what happened on the ground this week?
There's so many events happening, Ethan. I will say just on that point, I think the first week was really truly shock, right? I think shock as more facts unfolded and we see what happened. And then this week is kind of when the grieving process of sort of acceptance, I think talk about the different stages of grieving. This is where I think a lot of people are, particularly folks in Israel and Palestine who are very much in the thick of it. But to your point, what's happened on the ground this week? So far, there's been no Israeli ground operations inside Gaza that we know of, although, we're recording this on a Thursday afternoon on the 19th of October. So right now there isn't any operations happening. But there has been relentless.
That said, there was a video earlier today on Thursday of Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant speaking to Israeli troops outside of Gaza saying, you'll soon be inside. That could be posturing. We don't know exactly what the plan is, but we're anticipating an offensive soon.
No, they're very much literally quite at the gates, right? But, Ethan, we have seen, I think, relentless airstrikes continuing primarily in the northern Gaza Strip. And Israel has now issued an evacuation order from for residents of Gaza for that part of the territory and told them to move south towards the border with Egypt. Now, this really amounts to over 1 million people with nowhere to go. Coupled with the ongoing restrictions on water and food and fuel, it's really just become such a humanitarian disaster that's waiting to happen and has already happened. Of course, as you know, the big news of this week, has been the explosion at the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza City that Hamas's health ministry says killed over 400 people. I don't know if you saw this unfold, but it was just kind of surreal seeing the conflicting reports that came out from that part of the world and international media outlets. But what we saw was global media outlets had initially followed Hamas's lead and identified Israel as a culprit behind this attack. And then Israel denied and said that they were not responsible, but that an errant rocket from a Gaza-based group called the Islamic Jihad, which is tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, was to blame. And then U.S. intelligence has thus far, from the U.S. Defense Department, agreed with Israel's assessment. But I think the damage has already been done, right? The narrative has already been written from around the region.
We're in this moment where truth is sort of immaterial. I mean, I wrote something on Twitter, stupid, whatever. Been writing stuff on Twitter all week, just trying to express
join in
how
on the quips.
And join in on the screaming into the abyss. But I wrote something about, God doesn't keep a scorecard on all this. There is no grand moral arbiter of who's right and who's wrong. People have gone into their corners. They've assessed the evidence that they want to assess. The damage is done. So, to your point, one side is blaming Israel. The other side, Israel and the U.S. are blaming Palestinian Islamic Jihad. If we think that we're in a siloed media ecosystem, Helen, in the U.S. between the Fox News crowd and the MSNBC crowd, the silos that exist between Western media outlets and media outlets in the Arab world, these are just these bridges are too far to cross. So what happened? I mean, what did we see across the region in response to the hospital explosion.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there were enormous protests, in response to this horrific hospital explosion that went on across the region, had protesters clashing with Palestinian security forces in the Palestinian capital of Ramallah and called for the removal of the Palestinian Authority president, Mahmoud Abbas. And then there were also riots and protests in Amman, in Jordan, in Istanbul, in Ankara, and in Tunisia, where protesters actually, I think, just recently set fire to a centuries-old synagogue, which is pretty horrific. And then, of course, there were more significant protests in Beirut outside the US Embassy, which I'm sure would have been very, very triggering with a lot of, what happened in the US Embassy there in Lebanon earlier, a couple of decades ago. So, look, the region's unhappy. The region is very much grieving a lot of the loss of Palestinian lives over the last week. And in the the years prior, this is a sort of a cumulative grief that we're seeing pouring out onto the streets.
Yeah.
So, it's chaos.
And to put the tragedy at the hospital into perspective, and again, we're relying on figures here from the Hamas-run Palestinian Health Ministry. So, people will decide how credible that organization is. But if 500 people, 400, I think the number was 471, if that many people were killed, it would be the deadliest attack on Palestinian people in the history of the conflict. So, we're talking about the trauma that Israel has experienced on October 7th, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. This would be the deadliest day for Palestinians, the deadliest single strike for Palestinians. So this event, when it started, it seemed pretty clear that it could have some serious consequences. But Helen, flying through the sky on Air Force One into this chaos.
I mean, that's right.
The timing could not have been worse for an American president to arrive on the ground in Tel Aviv.
Truly.
But here comes President Biden.
Truly. I mean, you could not script this, right? It seems like something out of the West Wing, but you actually can't script this. So, yes, very poor timing. Hospital blast, of course, happened on Tuesday night when Biden had arrived in Israel on the Wednesday morning. So really just arrived to sort of the aftermath of all this. And, initially the goal of his trip was really twofold. One was to show support for Israel and help it plan its next steps. And then two, and this is a big one, is to meet in Amman with other Arab leaders, who are critical to sort of resolving this conflict and getting a ceasefire or figuring out a path forward. So he had on his agenda President Sisi of Egypt, President Abdullah of Jordan, and then, King Abdullah of Jordan, and then, of course, President Abbas of Palestine, to develop plans to avoid the conflict spreading across the region. But of course, even before he boarded Air Force One, the second part of that agenda was completely canned in response to the hospital blast. But, I'll say that's a real shame because, of course, this is a real opportunity lost and an opportunity missed for the US to show some real shuttle diplomacy there. But the trip, I think, was still somewhat successful, right? And you can push back on this even if you feel, but I think that Biden still convinced the Israelis to allow Egypt to open a humanitarian corridor to Gaza, which still hasn't officially opened, I acknowledge, as of recording, because Egypt has resisted third-party inspections on goods. But, that's at least showing some progress. And I think there's also some recognition among Israel's Western partners that it's now got to temper, its full-throated support for calls to minimize civilian suffering, right? And sort of we saw that with Biden urging Israel not to make the same mistakes as the US did after 9/11. And I think you had written a really fantastic LinkedIn post about this, Ethan. So maybe he took some, inspiration from that. But truly, it was to show that the emotional suffering and the emotional hijacking of the grief and the trauma from the events, it really meant that people were in the fog of war after the events happened. And so I think there was a real cautionary tale, I suppose, that Biden was trying to show Israel in order to sort of minimize civilian suffering in Gaza.
Yeah, and let's play a clip from that speech.
You can't look at what has happened here to your mothers, your fathers, your grandparents, sons, daughters, children, even babies, and not scream out for justice. Justice must be done. But I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes. I'm the first U.S. president to visit Israel in time of war. I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership. There's always cost, but it requires being deliberate. It requires asking very hard questions. It requires clarity about the objectives and an honest assessment about whether the path you're on will achieve those objectives.
Okay, so 2 questions from here. First of all, what happens next? Big question. And the second question, if you can get to it, is, are the Israelis in a position right now where they're able to listen to President Biden's advice on this piece?
Yeah, I mean, that's great questions as usual, Ethan. I think, look, what next is 2 things. 1 is diplomacy, and then 2 is deterrence, right? So I think they will remain the top priorities for the US and I think other Western allies who are trying to, I think, have an input on this in this conflict. On the diplomacy front, I think before Biden's trip, the Secretary of State, Blinken, had made 10 stops around the region in just 5 days, even though the trip was, I think, originally meant to be about 2 days. And European leaders had also been visiting Israel with the same exact message, which is that we're here with you, but don't cross the line, right? Western leaders know that as Israel's response grows, potentially into a ground invasion, as we talked about, containing the fallout of this will be a lot harder. So I think, that's why it leads to my second point. They're also using deterrence. So we've seen large and growing US and I think UK military presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the US has now apparently warned Hezbollah in Lebanon that if they join the fight, then the US will too. So that's a pretty strong signal to in terms of deterrence.
Yeah, but okay. So on that second question, I mean, are we at the point where some of those difficult questions about, I mean, the big question that Biden said that he asked Netanyahu during their meeting is, okay, you're planning to take out Hamas. What happens the next day? And apparently, according to reports, Netanyahu didn't have a good answer. He essentially said, we'll get to that when we get to it. So does it seem like we're in a position where good policy can be made?
I mean, no, is a short answer, right? I think, as I mentioned to you, I heard from a speaker a couple of weeks ago who was a former hostage negotiator for Israel. And this person actually flagged this concept, and he's a psychologist by training as well, this concept of emotional hijacking, which I had sort of flagged in our discussion. And that is what's happening on both sides right now. People are very much traumatized by what's happened and very much still in that process of grief that either sort of fuels them or drives them to sort of not be able to necessarily act with long-term vision, right? And I know I'm saying this in a very cold and very rational way, but I think when you're looking at things objectively, and this is the hard part about the geopolitical analysis that we're doing, because it is such a tragic and horrific set of events that have happened with long-term impacts. But I think right now that is where all the parties are, right? At that emotional hijacking stage where they're not really able to, and perhaps not willing to, think in the longer term of what might happen next. And that's where I think is really dangerous and really, I think, difficult for other parties, whether it's the Arab states that lean in or whether it's the US and other forces, to try and convince Israel to sort of temper their retaliatory strikes and try and sort of push the Palestinian Authority and other Arab states to come to the table. It's going to be really hard. And frankly, I don't think Israel wants to occupy Gaza. I really don't think that they want to be there for the long term, but they don't see any creative solutions to that right now. So I think we're going to be here for a long time. Yeah,
I think you could see the Biden visit, the Blinken visits. Man, a lot of airline miles for the Secretary of State. You could see those visits in the context of essentially just buying time. Bringing the temperature down in the region. Israel would not launch a ground invasion while President Biden was in Israel. They probably wouldn't do it while Secretary Blinken was in the region either. So giving the Israelis time to think about what their next steps are. I've been thinking about, I've been struck by this conundrum. I mean, this is one of the most difficult foreign policy moments that at least I haven't lived very long, but in my lifetime, certainly.
Even in my lifetime,
Yeah.
Ethan, can you believe it?
No way, no chance. But I can't stop thinking about this conundrum, this position that Israel's in, where they essentially have no choice. At least they see it as their political prerogative, at the very least, and it may be good security policy to remove Hamas from power.
Right.
Fine, that could be the case. The problem is, whatever you do to take Hamas out of Gaza will make the entire situation worse. That's how I'm feeling right now. Those are my personal reflections. That it's the ultimate rock in a hard place. I don't know how you're feeling.
Right. Well, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think even as I was finishing up my posting in Israel, I think the military analysts were pushing out even back then that there are a lot of more radical groups that have gained ascendancy in the Gaza Strip because they see Hamas as like being institutionalized and a little bit stale. And so I have no doubt that, once the Israelis, or if they remove also called neutralize Hamas as a threat, that there will be others that fill its void. Right. And so in some ways, I don't know. I think that you'll probably see a more radical alternative to Hamas. And certainly you can't see, it's just not viable for the Palestinian Authority, even if you wanted them to have power in Gaza. You can't have them ride on the backs of Israeli tanks into Gaza. How is that going to be taken optically and also politically? There's no way that the Gazan Palestinians would accept that. So look, I really don't know what's going to happen in terms of long-term solution in the Palestine in Gaza, and then also what happens then in the West Bank, right? Because I think this is one thing that maybe we haven't looked at as much, which is the destabilizing of or the sort of uprisings that may happen in the West Bank as well.
Yeah, I mean, you said it earlier, calls for President Abbas's removal during protests over the hospital explosion earlier this week. I think, Helen, you hit the nail on the head when you said, I don't know. Because guess what? I don't either. And I don't think we'll know much better.
It's tradecraft right there, Ethan. That's the best of the best tradecraft for you. That's how you diplomat. Look, I don't know. I think for me, in addition to saying I don't know, I think I've been very concerned on a personal level of the level of vitriol that we have seen, of course, from both sort of people supporting the Palestinian cause and folks who are supporting Israel and saying Israel has the right to defend itself. I think what my best solution is just to stay off social media and to best not lean into it, or at least wade into the comment section, because it is rather disturbing, and would just hope that everyone can look after their mental health, because it's a very, very tough time.
Stay off social media, sign up for Intrigue.
Correct, sign up for Intrigue, yes. That's right.
Make the world a better place. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Ethan.
Today's episode is brought to you by Rise. If you missed your chance to invest in a Ring or in a Nest, it's not too late to cash in on the next groundbreaking smart home innovation. It's called Rise. Their automated window shade tech has all the same features as their competitors, but sell at just a fraction of the price. And once they launch at Best Buy stores in a few weeks, they're poised to dominate the fast-growing smart shades market. So, take part in this exclusive public offering by clicking the link in the show notes. And that's going to do it for me. By the way, if you need some comic relief in these times, I know we all do, be sure to head over to the International Intrigue newsletter, where we're honoring the distinguished career of former British Prime Minister Liz Truss. In the meantime, I'm Ethan Plotkin. See you on Tuesday.